Welcome back. All right, so we're going to talk about the Tampa Bay Lightning. Believe this is the last team I haven't covered yet in the teams eliminated from the playoffs set of videos, but there are going to be new teams eliminated from the playoffs over the next week. So there will be other videos to get done. There will be 4 new teams. But for Tampa Bay, this is the earliest they've been eliminated from the playoffs in a long time. For the Tampa Bay Lightning, a 46-30-6 record this year. They did drop by 12 points from the year before. And it felt like all year like Tampa Bay wasn't quite the same. There was just something off. And it felt like the depth for Tampa Bay wasn't what it had been in previous seasons. And that's depth that had been eroded for years, right? For instance, you win a Stanley Cup, your third line is huge, and your third line is gone for the next season. It's just poof. And so eventually that catches up with the team, right? Now, Tampa Bay has had a really, really strong run, and they've been in win now mode. And I don't know when this ends, but I think it's soon. I'm going to say in the next couple of years, the win now mode is going to change at least a little bit. That being said, 2017 2018, their points percentage was 689. That year, they went all the way to the conference final. They lost in 7 games against Washington that year. Really strong run. But what everybody remembered was the following year, they finished first in the league. They had 62 wins. They end up with a 780 points percentage, and they get swept in the first round by Columbus. Columbus, not a team known as a playoff juggernaut going into the 2019 playoffs. And so it was a surprise, to put it mildly, that they got swept by Columbus. And it didn't even look like Columbus had to do a lot. It just the series fell apart for Tampa Bay. By the time they woke up and started fighting back, it was done. Then 2019, 2020, they showed how much fight back they had. Their points percentage dropped to 657, but they won the Stanley Cup. The following year, their points percentage 670. They win the Stanley Cup again, both times from third place in their division. Then last year, I believe they were third in the division both years they won the cup. They lost the final last year in 6 games against Colorado. They had a 671 points percentage. So their points percentage was actually a little bit better than it had been the previous 2 years where they won the Stanley Cup. But that's 3 straight Stanley Cup finals, something we hadn't seen in a long time. It's a lot of hockey. So this is a lot of hockey, putting a lot of miles on these guys. And it's tough. It's really, really tough. So this season, their points percentage of 598 was the lowest they'd had since the 2016-2017 season when they missed the playoffs. Just barely missed the playoffs that year, too. But the series started off really well. In Toronto, they won 7-3. This is a series where almost every game was won by the road team, the exception being game 2. Toronto wins a very key game 2, 7-2. Then they go to Tampa Bay, and overtime is their friend. Toronto beat Tampa Bay 4-3 in overtime in game 3 and 5-4 in overtime in game 4. So for Tampa Bay, they went to Toronto in a must-win situation, down 3 games to 1, and they won. They won 4-2 in Toronto. So now they're going home. They go to overtime again. They lose again in overtime, 2-1 against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, during that series, there was a lot of talk about how Tampa Bay was outplaying Toronto, but they weren't winning. As I'm recording this, we have Florida beating Toronto, and now I'm hearing about how Toronto's outplaying Florida, but they're not winning. In the playoffs, winning and losing isn't necessarily about who the best team is. It's about key goals at the right time. It's about, getting those really big saves, and it can be about momentum swings. And this year, Tampa Bay didn't have the kind of puck luck they did in previous seasons. So for the Tampa Bay Lightning, that loss of depth has been basically a slow erosion of the roster. And missing from that cup final run last year, Andre Palat really stands out. A big playoff performer. Last year in the playoffs, 23 games, 11 goals, 10 assists, 21 points. And any Devils fan will tell you he has made a difference to the Devils. They've made the playoffs. That's your first example. And second is he's been a key guy in the playoffs for them as well this year. Now, outside of Palat, you also lose a little bit of depth on the blue line. The McDonough trade that was done for salary cap reasons doesn't help them, right? Myers doesn't play for them. So 23 games for McDonough in last year's run. 1 goal, 4 assists, 5 points. And Jan Ruda, also gone from last year's blue line. 17 games, 1 goal, 4 assists, 5 points. So the overall picture when you're looking at the Lightning, it has been a slow erosion. And it's something I kept saying towards the end of the season. This Tampa Bay team, it just feels like the depth isn't the same. And in the playoffs, they also didn't get the performance from some of the players they would have wanted. Now, with Stamkos, 2 goals, 2 assists, 4 points, I understand that, and I saw comments when I talked about his performance up until that final game that, well, he's not performing great, I guess, but that's right around where he should be. But they really needed a big goal that didn't really come from Stamkos. Braden Point, who was dealing with injury, 2 goals, 2 assists, 4 points. Understanding the injury was there. But that's one of the things too when you've got a team that has so many long-term runs, all back to back to back like that. You're gonna have injuries. And then Nick Paul, 1 goal for Paul in the series against Toronto. Key goal when it happened, but they needed more from him. And then there's the Tanner Jeannot trade, which I think we'll be talking about for years. He only played 3 games in that series, had no points in that series, and wasn't really the driving force that I think Tampa Bay had envisioned. Last year, Tanner Jeannot was fantastic for the Nashville Predators. He was excellent. This year, he looked kind of lost, but again, he's young. Sure, can he bounce back? Absolutely. But it didn't happen. And then the biggest shock, if you're going to talk about a shock with Tampa, was Vasilevsky looked really human. So last year in the playoffs, he had a 922 save percentage. This year, 875 and a 2-4 record. So he did have a couple of good games in there, but he didn't look like the usual Andrei Vasilevsky. I haven't heard anything yet about maybe there being some sort of injury reason, like Ullmark with the Bruins, although the Bruins are still being cagey about what was going on, which makes me concerned in that case that maybe it's more than just something minor, because why wouldn't you guys talk about it now? But at any rate, Vasilevsky needed to play better than what he did for Tampa Bay in these playoffs, and going to Elliott was really not an option for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Then you look at their UFA situation, and Killorn's probably played his last game with Tampa Bay. Killorn got goals in this series. He didn't last year in the run to the final. And so Killorn likely to be a guy who gets picked up in the offseason by somebody else, because the cap space, according to Cap Friendly, is $1.6 million for next year. Now, I'm not sure if Seabrook's contract is being included. Maybe the LTIR for Seabrook isn't taken into consideration, which would give them a lot more cap space. However, you've also got Belmar. You've got Corey Perry, who may hang him up. I'll come back to Perry before this is done. Ian Cole, just a 1-year contract for him. And Elliott. So they're going to need to replace the backup goaltender. They're going to need to work on their bottom 6. And this is a team that very often gets guys from within to move up. So, like, for instance, Darren Radish will likely have a greater role next year, I would think. But then you got the RFAs as well. You've got Ross Colton. I like Colton. I don't know how much offensive upside is there. I would think 2-year contract for him, probably, 1.5, maybe 2 million. And Jeannot. What is Jeannot worth? Because he's an RFA this summer as well. And so now for Julien Brisebois, after going out and giving up a lot for Jeannot, now he has to decide how much money he's going to give him on a contract as well. And so a trade that is not aged particularly well, you can't afford to have the Jeannot contract end up not being a good one either. So there's some work to be done here. Then you look at next season and a salary cap issue that may show up next season. But Stamkos, $8.5 million. Remember when he signed that contract? I remember, because the channel was just getting started. It was in its infancy at that point. And I made the argument that because there were rumors Toronto was after him, that I didn't think Stamkos was a good investment for Toronto. I felt like it would be way too much money for Stamkos. The $8.5 million cap hit with Tampa, well below what I think Toronto would have given him if he had gone to market and gone to Toronto. But yeah, that contract's up next year. How much is he going to get on an extension? Is it still going to be in that $8.5 million range? How many years do you give him, right? And then there's Brandon Hagel. $1.5 million cap hit. Huge bargain for 1 more year, and he's an RFA. So they're going to want to sign him to a long-term contract, I would think. Hagel has earned that long-term contract, but this is a team that's going to, I would think, even when the salary cap goes up in 2024 at a reasonable rate, I would think they're still going to have cap issues. I think this is just how Tampa Bay is built. Now, they don't have any first-round picks for a while. I just put that up there. They don't have anything until the 6th round this year, and they have 2 sevenths as well. So, I mean, it's possible you take those 2 sevenths and try to get another 6th out of it. But, yeah, if you're a Tampa fan, you can kind of skip the draft. This year, you don't have to worry about the draft much at all. But that's because they traded away a lot of draft picks. And the Jeannot trade really stands out. So, They traded Cal Foot. They traded a 2023 third, fourth, fifth, a 2024 second, and a 2025 first, which is top 10 protected. It's important to make sure that's in there. Remember the Florida Fear there with the Montreal pick and all. Anyways, doing that for Jeannot is one that's going to stand out for some time because Jeannot didn't produce in Tampa Bay as expected. And not only that, but Cal Foot, if you caught games with him in Nashville, I thought he played well. I thought Cal Foot played better in Nashville than he did in Tampa. And so even if it was a 1-for-1, Jeannot for Foot, I think there's Nashville fans would say, you know what? We like Foot. He played well. Yeah, that was a good deal. But then you throw in all of the draft picks, and it's a landslide in favor of Nashville. Absolute landslide. They weren't getting anything out of Jeannot anyways. I believe he's 25, right? So yeah, I mean you're not looking at a 19-year-old kid that's going to become a 40-goal scorer. With Jeannot, you're getting a guy who can fight, who can hit, and theoretically should be a good offensive performer. But that theory didn't check out with Tampa Bay after the trade deadline. So in the previous year, they traded Taylor Radish and Boris Kachuk along with a 2023 first, which we now know is going to be the number 20 overall pick in a good draft, and a 2024 first, which is also top 10 protected, to the Chicago Blackhawks for Brandon Hagel, a 2022 fourth and a 2024 fourth. And this is where it's interesting because Hagel's $1.5 million. That's fine. But Radish, Kachuk, and you've got first round picks in here. It feels like that's a lot to spend. That's a lot to spend. And so the Tampa Bay Lightning, who for years now we've seen them make these trades, and we've gone, you know what? That's expensive, a first round pick for Coleman or for Goudreau, but they won. And so when a team makes these trades and they win, we can look back and go, hey, that was the right call. They made a good move. That was an expensive trade. They gave up some draft capital, they gave up some futures, but they did well. But when they don't win, as is the case with Tampa Bay this year, there's a lot more criticism to be had. Now, Corey Perry may have played his final game. There's the possibility he retires this year. His streak ends of 3 straight Stanley Cup finals. He didn't get that 4th straight Stanley Cup final. Of course, he lost all 3, Dallas, Montreal, and then Tampa Bay last year. So his chase for another cup ring, he does have one from his days in Anaheim. Those dreams are likely dashed at this point unless he signs a contract somewhere in the offseason. Maybe they bring him back for one more year. But his regular season numbers would tell you, as he's ready to turn 38 on May 16th, so a lot of people may be watching this after he turns 38, his numbers have dropped off, as expected when a player reaches their late 30s. So last year, in 82 games, he had 19 goals, 21 assists, 40 points, and he was a +9. This year, in 81 games, 12 goals, 13 assists, 25 points, and he's a -28. So if he did come back for another year, you have to think his offensive numbers would drop off a little bit more. Now, in the playoffs, he was one of their better players against Toronto. So that would lend itself to the idea that maybe there's some more gas left in the tank. Maybe he signs a 1-year contract, goes back to Anaheim to finish out his career there. Maybe he decides to go back to Dallas for one more year. Maybe they figure out a way to get him on their roster. Or maybe he does end up signing for another year in Tampa. But it does feel like with Corey Perry, his production will likely continue to drop, and they're going to need to look in another direction. And the salary cap's going to be a hindrance for at least this coming season. So for Tampa Bay, I guess the question I have is, because there's some doom and gloom in this, comparatively speaking, with normally talking about Tampa Bay's offseason. It does feel like that window that is always talked about. I always hear, is the window closed? Is the window closed? And I always think, windows. Because, and the reason that I don't talk about it so much is because it does feel like there's times when people say, well, this team's window's opening and this team's window's closing and then some team that we haven't even talked about their window, who cares about they'll end up going all the way to the final, or they'll have an incredible run, or potentially win a Stanley Cup after people say that the window's closed. I watched Detroit do that. Detroit's old, their window's closed, and then they won another Stanley Cup. So it does happen. But are we looking at a Tampa Bay team that, or a better way to put it is, so are they capable of getting back to what they were in previous seasons and get back into championship form. That might be a better way of putting it. Because I don't, the whole window discussion to me is just, I throw it out the window. But let me know your thoughts. Do you feel like the Tampa Bay Lightning have peaked and thus at this point maybe stop trading first round picks? Maybe, figure out how you're going to navigate this because they're, teams just, they get older, players get older. As players get older, they usually will have more chance of an injury, and it might take them a little bit longer to come back than it did when they were younger. And so are we looking at a Tampa Bay team that, yep, they got their Stanley Cups, they made it to 3 Cup finals, and those days are done for a while? Or can they turn this around? What can they do to turn this around? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for all your support. The growth on this channel has been ridiculous over the last month. I would like to thank each and every one of you who've been recommending videos, who've been watching videos, who's been commenting and thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever you do, whatever interaction you have with the video makes a difference. So thank you guys so much for that. And I will talk to you again soon.